Pine Valley had always been a place where time seemed to drift slower than in the rest of the world. Nestled deep within the embrace of the Rocky Mountains, this small town of just over 300 residents lived in quiet harmony with the wilderness surrounding them. Rustic wooden homes, their chimneys curling with wisps of smoke, dotted the landscape, while the main street consisted of a handful of family-owned businesses that had faithfully served the community for generations. The morning sun struggled to pierce through the thick shroud of clouds hanging low over the mountain peaks. A gentle breeze carried the crisp scent of pine needles, mingling with the earthy aroma of impending rain. The calendar read mid-October, and the mountains had already donned their brilliant hues of red and gold, a stark reminder that winter's grip would soon take hold. At the eastern edge of town, where civilization gradually yielded to untamed wilderness, lay Pine Valley Cemetery. Its carefully tended grounds stood in quiet contrast to the dense forest, pressing against its wrought iron fence. Ancient pine trees towered like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching toward the gray sky. Weathered headstones told the stories of those who had once walked these mountain paths, their final resting place a solemn testament to the deep roots that bound the community together. Today, the town had come together to bid farewell to Eleanor Matthews, a woman whose life had been intricately woven into the fabric of Pine Valley. For 42 years, she had taught at Pine Valley Elementary School, shaping young minds and touching hearts with her gentle wisdom and unwavering dedication. 3 generations had passed through her classroom, learning not only reading and arithmetic, but also the values she held dear: kindness, perseverance, and a sense of community. The news of her passing had spread through town like ripples on a still pond, leaving sorrow in its wake. She had lived alone in a modest house near the school, surrounded by books and an ever-growing collection of letters and drawings from former students who had never forgotten her influence. Even in her later years, when arthritis had forced her to retire, she could often be found sitting on her porch, offering cookies and quiet advice to anyone who stopped by. As mourners gathered at the cemetery, an unusual stillness hung in the air. The birds, normally filling the morning with their songs, remained eerily quiet. The only sounds were the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel and the hushed murmurs of those who had come to pay their respects. Black umbrellas dotted the landscape like solemn blooms, their owners preparing for the rain that loomed overhead. None among them could have predicted that this day would carve itself into Pine Valley's history for reasons far beyond grief. The peaceful mountain town was about to face a trial that would shake its foundations, challenging everything its people believed about life, death, and the wild forces that loomed just beyond their quiet existence. Pine Valley had always been a place where time seemed to move more slowly than the rest of the world. Nestled in the embrace of the Rocky Mountains, the small town of just over 300 souls lived in harmony with the wilderness that surrounded them. Rustic wooden homes with smoke curling from their chimneys dotted the landscape, while the main street consisted of a handful of family-owned businesses that had served the community for generations. The morning sun struggled to break through the thick blanket of clouds that hung low over the mountain peaks. A gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of pine needles and the earthy aroma of approaching rain. The calendar marked mid-October, and the mountains had already dressed themselves in brilliant shades of red and gold, warning of the harsh winter that would soon arrive. Pine Valley Cemetery lay at the eastern edge of town, where civilization gradually surrendered to wilderness. The carefully maintained grounds stood in stark contrast to the untamed forest that pressed against its wrought iron fence. Ancient pine trees stood as silent sentinels, their branches reaching toward the gray sky like gnarled fingers. Weathered headstones told stories of the generations who had lived and died in this mountain haven, their final resting place a testament to the deep roots that bound the community together. Today, the town had gathered to say goodbye to Eleanor Matthews, a woman whose life had been woven into the very fabric of Pine Valley. For 42 years, she had taught at Pine Valley Elementary School, shaping young minds and touching hearts with her gentle wisdom and unwavering dedication. 3 generations of town residents had passed through her classroom, learning not just reading and arithmetic, but also the values of kindness, perseverance, and community that she held dear. The news of her passing had spread through town like ripples on a still pond, leaving grief in its wake. She had lived alone in her modest home near the school, surrounded by books and the countless letters and drawings from former students who never forgot her impact on their lives. Even in her final years, when arthritis had forced her to retire, Eleanor could often be found on her porch, offering cookies and advice to anyone who stopped by. As mourners began to arrive at the cemetery, the air held an unusual stillness. Birds that normally filled the morning with their songs remained oddly quiet. The only sound was the soft crunch of shoes on gravel and the whispered conversations of people gathering to pay their respects. Black umbrellas dotted the landscape like solemn flowers, their owners preparing for the rain that threatened overhead. None of those present could have known that this day would become part of Pine Valley's history for reasons far different than they expected. The peaceful mountain town was about to face a test that would shake its foundations and challenge everything they thought they knew about life, death, and the wild nature that surrounded them. By 10 o'clock, cars lined the narrow cemetery road, their black surfaces gleaming under the threatening sky. Sarah Matthews, Eleanor's only daughter, stood near the freshly dug grave, accepting condolences with quiet grace. Her eyes, red-rimmed from days of grief, watched as the funeral home staff made final preparations. Her own children, now adults themselves, stood close by, offering silent support as their mother faced the hardest day of her life. The polished oak coffin rested on the lowering device, its surface adorned with a spray of local wildflowers. Eleanor had always said she wanted her funeral to reflect the natural beauty of Pine Valley, and her wishes had been honored in every detail. The minister, Reverend Thompson, reviewed his notes while the funeral director, Mr. Wells, quietly directed his staff in positioning chairs for the elderly attendees. Former students, now grown with families of their own, arrived in steady groups. Many carried umbrellas, more out of habit than necessity, as the heavy clouds above seemed hesitant to release their burden. The temperature had dropped noticeably since morning, and breath formed small clouds in the increasingly cold air. Something about the weather felt wrong, unseasonal even for October in the mountains. Mrs. Henderson, who had taught alongside Eleanor for 20 years, approached Sarah with trembling steps. The two women embraced, sharing tears and memories of the remarkable woman they had both loved. "Your mother," Mrs. Henderson whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "She was the heart of this town. Even after retirement, children would stop by her house just to talk. She never turned anyone away." The funeral home staff moved with practiced efficiency, arranging everything according to plan. Yet there was an undercurrent of unease among them. Mr. Wells, with 40 years of experience serving Pine Valley's families, kept glancing toward the tree line. His instincts, honed by a lifetime in these mountains, sensed something amiss in the unusual silence of the forest. Small groups of mourners huddled together, sharing stories about Eleanor. A former student, now the town's police chief, recalled how she had encouraged him to overcome his reading difficulties. Another remembered her staying late after school to help with math homework. Each story painted a picture of a woman whose kindness had rippled through generations. The mountain wind picked up, carrying with it the sharp scent of pine and something else, something wild and unfamiliar. The trees at the forest's edge swayed, their branches casting shifting shadows across the gathered mourners. In the distance, a crow called out a harsh warning, its cry echoing across the cemetery before being swallowed by the heavy silence that followed. The first signs of trouble appeared like whispers in the wind, small details that might have gone unnoticed on any ordinary day. The usual bustle of wildlife that made Pine Valley Cemetery their home had suddenly ceased. The squirrels that normally darted between headstones, gathering acorns for winter, were nowhere to be seen. The chickadees and nuthatches that typically filled the old pine trees with their songs had fallen silent. Mr. Wells, the funeral director, felt it first. After 30 years of conducting services in this cemetery, he had developed a deep connection with the mountain's rhythms. Today, those rhythms felt wrong. The air held an unusual heaviness, thick with tension that made him constantly glance toward the tree line. He noticed Chief Roberts, standing near the back of the gathering, shared his unease. The mourners continued to listen to Reverend Thompson's prayers, but attention began to waver as nature's warnings grew stronger. A sound came from the forest edge, too heavy to be blamed on the wind. Branches cracked under substantial weight, and undergrowth rustled with purposeful movement. Several heads turned toward the noise, momentarily distracted from the service. Sarah Matthews, still standing brave beside her mother's coffin, pulled her black shawl tighter around her shoulders. The gesture had nothing to do with the autumn chill. Something about the forest's silence spoke to ancient instincts, warning of danger. Other mourners began to shift in their seats, responding to fears they couldn't yet name. The children sensed it most clearly. Little Tommy Parker, Eleanor's great-nephew, clutched his mother's hand with unusual force. "The animals are hiding," he whispered, his young voice carrying in the unnatural quiet. His mother tried to shush him, but others had already noticed the truth in his words. The normal background noise of the forest had disappeared entirely, replaced by an eerie stillness. Then came the sounds that no mountain resident could ignore. Deep in the forest, something large moved with deliberate steps. The unmistakable sound of heavy breathing, followed by the snap of a thick branch, caused Chief Roberts to instinctively reach for his hip, though he wore no weapon at the funeral. His years of experience with mountain wildlife told him this was no deer or elk. Mrs. Henderson, arranging the last of the flowers near the coffin, stopped mid-motion. Her hands trembled as she set down a bouquet of white lilies. "Something's not right," she murmured to those nearby. The words spread through the gathering like ripples in still water, passing from person to person in hushed tones. The threatening clouds hung lower now, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. Mr. Wells caught Chief Roberts' eye again, and both men recognized the gravity of the situation. Something had sent the smaller wildlife into hiding, something large enough to command respect. The chief began moving quietly through the crowd, whispering gentle warnings to stay calm and be ready to move if necessary. A strong gust of wind swept through the cemetery, carrying a distinct musky scent that made several people gasp. The flower arrangement swayed, petals scattering across the ground like tiny messengers of chaos. Reverend Thompson's Bible pages fluttered, forcing him to pause in his reading. In that moment of silence, everyone heard it clearly. A deep, rumbling sound from just beyond the tree line, followed by the unmistakable scrape of claws against bark. It was Mrs. Henderson who saw it first. Her hands flew to her mouth, stifling a scream that would have come too late as a warning. Through the gap between two ancient pines emerged a massive grizzly bear, its brown fur darkened by the recent rains. The animal stood at least 8 feet tall on its hind legs, its powerful shoulders rolling with each deliberate step forward. For one eternal moment, no one moved. Reverend Thompson's voice trailed off mid-prayer, his Bible hanging forgotten at his side. The bear's presence seemed impossible, like a nightmare intruding into the waking world. Its small, intelligent eyes surveyed the gathering, nostrils flaring as it tested the air. Then someone whispered, "Oh my God," and the spell of stillness shattered. Chaos erupted in waves. The closest mourners scrambled backward, their black formal shoes slipping on the damp grass. Chairs toppled as elderly attendees were helped to their feet by younger family members. A child began to cry, the sound quickly muffled by a parent's protective embrace. Chief Roberts' voice cut through the growing panic, firm but quiet. "Nobody run. Move slowly toward your cars. Stay together." His calm authority helped prevent an immediate stampede, but fear had already taken hold of the gathering. The bear dropped to all fours, its massive head swinging from side to side as it assessed the movement before it. Sarah Matthews stood frozen beside her mother's coffin, her grief momentarily replaced by primal fear. Her son James tried to pull her away, but she seemed rooted to the spot. The bear was between them and their car, its huge body blocking the most direct escape route. Mr. Wells, despite his years of experience with mountain wildlife, felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He had never seen a grizzly this close to town, especially not one so bold. Something about its behavior felt wrong, unnatural. The bear showed no sign of fear, no hesitation about approaching such a large group of humans. Parents passed their children behind them, creating a human chain moving away from the predator. The sound of car doors opening seemed impossibly loud in the tense atmosphere. Those who had parked closest to the cemetery gate began slowly backing away, keys trembling in their hands. The bear took another step forward, powerful muscles rippling beneath its thick fur. Its claws, each longer than a human finger, left deep marks in the soft earth. The scent of flowers mixed with the musky odor of wet fur and wild animal, creating a surreal combination that would haunt the mourners' memories. A sudden movement caught the bear's attention. Tommy Parker, only 6 years old, had broken free from his mother's grasp and run 3 steps before she caught him. The bear's head snapped toward the movement, its ears flattening against its skull. A deep growl rumbled from its chest, vibrating through the ground like distant thunder. "Nobody move," Chief Roberts commanded, his voice barely above a whisper. He had positioned himself between the bear and the largest group of mourners, though he knew he stood little chance against such a powerful animal. The nearest weapon was in his patrol car, parked what now seemed like miles away. The bear rose again to its hind legs, reaching its full height. Several people gasped. Standing upright, it dwarfed everyone present, a living reminder of nature's raw power. Its shadow fell across Eleanor's coffin, the polished wood reflecting the animal's massive silhouette. Time seemed to slow down. The threatening clouds finally released their burden, and a light rain began to fall. Water droplets beaded on the bear's fur, running down its face like tears. The animal's breath came in visible puffs in the cold air, each exhale carrying another rumbling growl. No one could have predicted what happened next. The bear dropped back to all fours and, instead of charging or retreating, began to move with deliberate steps toward the coffin itself. Its intentions, impossible to read in its wild eyes, would soon become terrifyingly clear. Time seemed to stop as the massive grizzly approached Eleanor's coffin with deliberate steps. Each padded footfall brought it closer to the polished oak box, its breath visible in the cold mountain air. Sarah Matthews, still standing nearby, felt her daughter pulling desperately at her arm, but she remained transfixed by the surreal scene unfolding before her. The bear moved with an almost curious demeanor, its nose twitching as it caught unfamiliar scents. The fresh flowers adorning the coffin swayed in the light rain, their sweet fragrance mixing with the wild, musky smell of the predator. Those mourners who hadn't yet reached their cars stood in horrified silence, unable to look away from the scene that seemed more like a terrible dream than reality. Chief Roberts remained still, his experienced eyes tracking every movement of the massive animal. In all his years of mountain law enforcement, he had never witnessed anything like this. Bears typically avoided human gatherings, especially ones with so many people present. Yet this one showed no fear, no hesitation in its approach. The grizzly reached the coffin, its enormous head now level with the flower arrangements. Its wet fur glistened in the gray light, drops of water running down its powerful shoulders. The animal's size became even more apparent as it stood beside the casket. One swipe of its massive paw could splinter the wood like kindling. Then came the moment that would haunt Pine Valley's residents for years to come. The bear pressed its nose against the coffin's side, inhaling deeply. A low rumble emerged from its chest, different from its earlier threatening growls. This sound carried a note of something else, something almost like recognition. Without warning, the bear raised one enormous paw and placed it on the coffin's lid. The wood creaked under the weight, and several people cried out in horror. Sarah finally found her voice, a strangled "no" escaping her lips. The sound drew the bear's attention for a brief moment, its dark eyes meeting hers with an intelligence that seemed almost human. The coffin shifted on its stand, the movement causing the flower arrangements to slide. Lilies and roses scattered across the wet grass as the bear applied more pressure. The funeral home staff watched in helpless terror as their carefully made preparations were disrupted by this unimaginable intervention. Mrs. Henderson, who had been Eleanor's closest friend, began to pray audibly, her trembling voice carrying across the cemetery. Others joined in, their whispered prayers creating a soft backdrop to the incredible scene. The bear seemed oblivious to their voices, fully focused on the coffin beneath its paw. Then came the sound that turned everyone's blood to ice. A distinct creak emerged from within the coffin itself, followed by a subtle movement that had nothing to do with the bear's touch. Sarah's legs gave way, and she would have fallen if not for her daughter's support. Mr. Wells, with decades of funeral experience, felt his professional composure crumble as he witnessed something that defied all explanation. The coffin shook again, this time more noticeably. The bear withdrew its paw and took a single step back, as if it too was surprised by this development. The movement came again, stronger this time, accompanied by a muffled sound from within. Several mourners broke from their frozen state and fled toward their cars, unable to bear witness to whatever was about to happen. Chief Roberts had begun slowly moving forward, though he knew he had no real way to intervene. The bear's massive body still stood between him and the coffin, but its attention had shifted entirely to the mysterious movement beneath the polished wood. Rain fell more heavily now, drumming against the coffin lid like nature's own funeral march. The bear made a sound then, not a growl or a roar, but something more like a whine. It nudged the coffin again, almost gently this time, as if encouraging whatever stirred within. The wood creaked one final time, and then the unthinkable happened. The lid moved ever so slightly, but enough for everyone to see that it was no trick of the light or result of the bear's touch. Sarah Matthews fainted, her daughter barely managing to ease her to the ground. Reverend Thompson's Bible slipped from his nerveless fingers, landing in the wet grass with a soft thud. The bear remained surprisingly calm, watching the coffin with what could only be described as expectation in its wild eyes. In that moment, as rain fell from dark skies and terror gripped every heart, the line between the natural and supernatural world seemed to blur. The bear had not come to terrorize or destroy, but to reveal something that would change Pine Valley forever. What happened next would challenge everything the townspeople thought they knew about life, death, and the mysteries that lurked in their mountain home. The world seemed to hold its breath as the coffin lid shifted again. Chief Roberts made a split-second decision that would later be debated throughout Pine Valley for months to come. "Everyone clear the area," he commanded, his voice cutting through the rain. "Move to your vehicles now." But Sarah Matthews, having regained consciousness, broke free from her daughter's grasp. "That's my mother in there," she cried out, her voice cracking with emotion. The bear's head swung toward her, its eyes reflecting an almost supernatural intelligence. Rather than charging, it made a soft huffing sound, as if trying to communicate something beyond human understanding. Mr. Wells stepped forward, decades of professional composure warring with raw fear. "Sarah, please," he pleaded. "We don't know what's happening here, but staying close is too dangerous." His words carried the weight of experience, but they fell on deaf ears. Sarah took another step toward the coffin, drawn by forces stronger than fear. The community's response crystallized in that moment. Instead of fleeing, several men and women moved forward to stand with Sarah. Mrs. Henderson, still trembling but determined, positioned herself beside her friend's daughter. Chief Roberts recognized the shift in the crowd's energy, the individual terror giving way to collective courage. The bear remained surprisingly still, its massive form more guardian than threat. Rain continued to fall, soaking through formal clothes and turning the ground treacherous underfoot. The coffin moved again, more forcefully this time, the sound of wood straining against its hinges echoing across the cemetery. "If we're going to do something, it needs to be now," Chief Roberts announced, his mind racing through options. He had no tranquilizer gun, no way to safely remove the bear. Yet the animal's behavior defied everything he knew about wildlife. It seemed to be waiting for something, purposefully keeping everyone at bay while whatever was happening inside the coffin continued. A small group of local hunters had begun to edge toward their trucks, where rifles were safely stored, but the chief raised his hand, stopping them. "No sudden movements," he warned. "We're past the point where that would help." The bear's ears twitched at his voice, but it remained focused on the coffin. The tension reached an unbearable peak as the lid shifted more dramatically. Sarah sobbed, the sound carrying clearly through the rain. The bear responded with another soft whine, its massive head lowering slightly as if in sympathy. The gathered crowd watched in helpless fascination as the impossible scene continued to unfold. Thunder rolled across the mountains, much closer now. The storm that had threatened all morning was finally arriving in force. Lightning illuminated the scene in harsh flashes, casting strange shadows across the gathered faces and the bear's wet fur. Each flash revealed the coffin lid rising slightly higher. Mr. Wells moved to Sarah's side, his professional instincts finally overridden by the unprecedented situation. "In 40 years of service," he whispered, "I've never seen anything like this. But whatever's happening, we face it together." His words seemed to strengthen those around him, the community drawing closer despite the danger. The bear suddenly reared up on its hind legs, reaching its full height. Several people gasped, but no one ran. They had passed the point of flight, entering unknown territory where normal rules no longer applied. The massive animal brought one paw down on the coffin lid with decisive force, and the sound of splintering wood filled the air. Chief Roberts made his final decision. Instead of trying to control the situation, he would trust in something he didn't understand. "Let it happen," he called out, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Whatever this is, it's beyond our power to stop it." The mourners drew together, their fear transforming into a kind of collective awe. The bear settled back on all fours, and in the next flash of lightning, they all saw it clearly. The coffin lid had broken free, and what lay within would change their understanding of life and death forever. Lightning flashed across the sky as the coffin lid fell away completely. Inside, Eleanor Matthews lay peacefully, exactly as she had been prepared for burial, but with one impossible difference. Clutched in her hands was a small leather pouch, one that hadn't been there when the coffin was closed. The bear's behavior suddenly made sense. The pouch carried a strong scent of honey and berries, mixed with mountain herbs that Eleanor had always gathered on her walks. Sarah reached forward, her hands shaking as she gently took the pouch from her mother's hands. The bear watched intently but made no move to stop her. As Sarah opened the worn leather bag, tears began streaming down her face. Inside was a collection of dried flowers, herbs, and a handwritten note in her mother's familiar handwriting. "For my friend in the mountains," the note read, "who walked with me on my final days." The truth dawned slowly across the gathered faces. Eleanor, who had spent her last months taking daily walks in the mountains despite her failing health, had formed an unlikely bond. The bear had not come to terrorize or destroy, but to return a final gift and pay its respects. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her voice trembling with emotion. "She told me about seeing a bear on her walks," she revealed. "I thought age had confused her mind, but Eleanor insisted it would sit and watch her gather herbs, never threatening, just keeping her company." The massive grizzly slowly backed away from the coffin, its purpose apparently fulfilled. The rain began to ease and rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a surreal glow over the scene. The bear paused at the forest's edge, rose one final time to its full height, and released a mournful sound that echoed through the mountains. Chief Roberts watched in amazement as the animal disappeared into the forest as quietly as it had emerged. The tension that had gripped the gathering slowly dissolved, replaced by a sense of wonder. People began to share stories they had dismissed before, times when Eleanor had spoken of her mountain friend and the peace she found in the wilderness. The funeral resumed, but it was transformed into something more than a farewell. It became a celebration of Eleanor Matthews' unique spirit, her connection to the mountains, and her ability to find friendship in the most unexpected places. The tale of the bear's visit would be told and retold in Pine Valley for generations to come. As the coffin was finally lowered into the earth, Sarah placed the leather pouch beside it. "Mom always said nature held secrets we couldn't understand," she said softly. "She taught us to respect the wilderness, to see the magic in the mountains. Even at the end, she was still teaching us." The community lingered long after the service concluded, drawn together by their shared experience of something extraordinary. The event had shaken their understanding of the boundary between the wild and the civilized, between the natural and the supernatural. Pine Valley would never be quite the same. The story of Eleanor Matthews and her bear guardian would become part of the town's legacy, a reminder that some bonds transcend the normal boundaries of nature. The mountain paths she had walked would be treated with new reverence, and those who walked them would sometimes catch glimpses of a massive brown form watching from the trees, still keeping its ancient vigil over the town and its people. Years passed, but Pine Valley never forgot the day when nature itself came to mourn Eleanor Matthews. The story became part of the town's identity, whispered around campfires and told to wide-eyed children on stormy nights. The cemetery, once simply a place of rest, took on an almost magical quality in the community's eyes. Sarah Matthews continued her mother's tradition of gathering mountain herbs, though she never walked the trails alone. Sometimes on quiet mornings, she would catch glimpses of a massive brown form moving through the distant trees. The bear remained a guardian of the mountain paths, appearing occasionally As if checking on the town Eleanor had loved so dearly, the school where Eleanor had taught for so many years established a nature program in her memory. Children learned about respect for wildlife and the delicate balance between their town and the wilderness that surrounded it. Her leather pouch, recovered from the gravesite years later, became a treasured artifact in the town museum, a testament to unexpected friendships and unspoken connections. Pine Valley changed in subtle ways after that rainy autumn day. The townspeople developed a deeper appreciation for the mysteries that lurked in their mountain home. They learned to listen more carefully to the whispers of the forest and to respect the ancient wisdom that sometimes came wrapped in unexpected packages. Eleanor's grave, marked by a simple headstone, often bore fresh wildflowers, placed there by both human hands and, some swore, by larger, gentler paws than any person possessed. Want to discover more extraordinary tales from the wilderness? Subscribe to our newsletter for weekly stories that blur the line between natural and supernatural. Join our community of storytellers and adventure seekers as we explore the mysteries that hide in plain sight. Click the subscribe button below to ensure you never miss another amazing story.